All right, well, thank you, everybody. We've got a full house here today for our first presentation in our Vine Author Series. I'm very happy to have Thomas Maltman here with us. Tom and I took some classes together in the MFA Creative Writing program at MSU, the earlier part of this century. As you can tell, he is making better use of that MFA degree, the one that I did not quite complete. I will admit that up front.
There's still time, Mike.
What's that?
There's still time.
Yes, I hope so. I've been meaning to drop Rick Robbins a note and see just how far we can extend that without.
6-year limit.
Yeah, that's what I kind of figured. So anyway, I'll let Renita in. We are up to 19 participants, including me and our presenter. So what we're going to do is Thomas is just going to kind of take the lead here and take us through some of the story of The Land, which is his latest book that'll be coming out still in October. Tom, is that the?
October, yeah.
All right. So I will ask, just because we do have some things that happen in the background, if you can mute yourselves, that would be great so we don't get the errant phone call or the barking dog on the recording. That would be wonderful. And then I will now step aside and introduce Thomas Maltman.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for this invitation, Mike. Thank you to all of you who have shown up on this beautiful afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here talking to you about my third novel, The Land. And so I'm going to open by just telling you a little bit behind the story. I often find when I go and talk to people, different groups about the newest novel, one of the biggest questions I get is where do you get your ideas, or where did this idea come from? And so I'm going to talk about how the novel came about. I'm just going to read a really brief piece about it. Then I want to introduce you to two of my favorite characters from the book. So I'll introduce you to two characters and just read from some short passages in the novel. And then we'll turn it over to all of you. Any questions that any of you might have about either this novel, The Land, or I've got two other novels too that are also set in Minnesota. The Nightbirds was my first novel, and that's about the 1862 Dakota conflict and the mass hangings in Mankato. My second novel, The Little Wolves, is set on the prairies just outside of Mankato during the 1980s farming crisis. And this one, The Land, that's coming out in October, is set in 1999, just before the turn of the millennium. So I'm getting closer gradually to the present day. I was disappointed when my second novel came out to find out that the 1980s doesn't make it a contemporary novel. It actually still qualifies as historical fiction. And so I guess you could say that all three of my novels are historical fiction. So when I'm done with my presentation, I'll keep things rather short about the story behind the story and just want to read a couple of those really quick passages. Then we'll open it up to your questions. And then Mike said that there's a fair number of writers out there, a fair number of people who are interested in memoir and in writing. And so I thought what we could do afterwards is I would lead you in a short writing activity. It's one of my favorite writing activity from classes. And we could see what kind of ideas it sparks based on this writing activity. And so I want to make sure that this is interactive at the same time, not just us talking, but also a chance for you to engage your own imaginations and see what surprises might lie in store when you start writing. All right, so I'll go ahead and start talking then about The Land. So this is my third novel, as I mentioned, set in 1999, and it changed quite a bit when I first started writing it. So it's a story about a young man. He's been involved with a woman at a bank. She goes missing. He suspects that the people who are a part of this right-wing church had something to do with her disappearance. He doesn't know if she's gone, if she ran away, if she's dead. He doesn't know what's happened, but he sets out himself to investigate where she went or what happened to her. And so it's the story of what happens to him. As he sets out to do this investigation, he becomes involved or more tangled up in this church than he ever imagined he would be. And it's about the troubles he encounters during that one winter of 1999. So I'm going to read to you a really short piece about the story behind it, and then just a couple of passages from the novel itself about The Land. And so here it is. Here's how the story started. The story started with a dog, or rather a husband and a wife, who asked me to care for their house in the country while they were gone for the winter. They gave me one strict instruction: make sure the dog survives. Over winter, the loneliest winter in my life, I did just that. And when the owners returned in spring, they put the old dog to sleep. It's not much as anecdotes go. I have never liked irony. Yet that winter haunted my imagination. Here I was out in the country, surrounded by wilderness, visited at night by coyotes. I had never experienced such cold or waded through such deep snow. I worried over their koi, frozen in the pond. A curious thing happens when memory mingles with the imagination. When I started this novel, I meant to set it in the inland Northwest, which was where I was living at the time I cared for that house. I wanted to set it there for family reasons as well. You see, the title for the land comes from family history. My family knows the pull of the wilderness. In the 1980s, my grandparents purchased heavily forested land in Northern California. The entire family, all 6 of their children, invested in the purchase of this land. Legend has it they were inspired by the publication of Hal Lindsey's The Late Great Planet Earth, a book that predicted the end times were upon us. I grew up hearing about the Great Tribulation from my grandparents, listened while great uncles debated gravely about the mark of the beast and the coming of the Antichrist. My grandparents named the property they built the land. It was meant to be partly a vacation spot, but also a refuge against the apocalypse. Later, in 1999, as fears about Y2K spread, some members of my family looked again to the property as a place of safety. One relative talked openly about a man he knew who could dynamite the only bridge heading into Scotts Valley. While the land as described in the novel bears a resemblance to the place we knew and have long since sold, I want to be clear that my family never belonged to any Christian identity church. And it's a white supremacist church. And these churches are also right here in Minnesota right now. Star Tribune just broke an article about one of these churches setting up right in rural Minnesota. So they are a very real thing. This novel is not about my family or anyone in it, but instead explores what happens when the fearful eschatology of dispensationalism intermingles with racist belief systems. As a Christian, I've long been concerned with how American Christianity has been co-opted by nationalism and other toxic ideologies. And while I've sometimes been accused of having an overly Gothic mindset, if your grandmother reads to you from the book of Revelation when you were a child, it does things to your imagination. I've kept the faith in my own way. Writing the novel allowed me to return to the land. So how and why did the novel setting move from the inland Northwest to the upper Midwest, a place long since which has a reputation as a progressive state? And so here's how it happened. In the mid-1990s, the botched federal raid of the Weaver cabin and the violent deaths of 3 people there during an 11-day siege had left enduring scars in the region where I lived. Yet as I did research, all signs kept pointing me back to the Midwest. Randy and Vicki Weaver were from small-town Iowa and were married in Fort Dodge. The 1990s spawned the Posse Comitatus in North Dakota, while the Aryan Republican Army was busy robbing banks across Ohio. Timothy McVeigh, who lived for a time in Michigan, committed the worst act of domestic terrorism the nation had yet experienced in Oklahoma City. Local research offered no reprieve. I discovered a Christian identity church like the one described in the novel right over in Fridley, Minnesota, no more than 10 miles from my home. The church is no longer active. I found out that Charles Weissman, a prolific publisher of racist propaganda for the Christian identity movement, operated his press right out of Apple Valley, Minnesota. The white supremacists who had been ready to consign to the mountains of Idaho or the deep south, they were right here living among us in our very backyard. As I wrote, I thought about how white supremacy and the violence that such groups engender are little like natural disasters. They only happen in other places, not where we live, and certainly not in the private spaces of our own hearts. The more I read and researched, the more I knew I had to bring this novel home. For all these reasons, the setting moved to the most wildest and beautiful place I knew in the Minnesota, the Arrowhead region. Meanwhile, as I wrote, residents of Grand Marais were unable to stop the leader of a fundamentalist Mormon cult from settling on property just west of town. It was another reminder of how this can happen anywhere. Dreamers and visionaries have long known the allure of the wilderness, a part of our American psyche. It's the land that calls to so many of us. So that's just a little bit about how the novel came about. And I was surprised that a novel set in 1999, right before Y2K, how it could have so many different echoes of what we are going through right now in 2020. And so that was not something that I planned on as I wrote and as I told the story. And so I just want to introduce you or just share with you a couple of different passages from the novel. Two of the female characters who are some of my favorite characters in the book. I just want to show you the first few passages where you meet these characters, and then we'll open it up to whatever questions you have, whether it's about this particular novel, whether it's about writing itself, anything that you want to ask, it would be my pleasure to answer. And so in this first passage here, this is from the first chapter where the young man goes to this white supremacist church where the woman who's gone missing, her husband is the pastor. And so in the midst of this sermon, as he's going on, the young man has a flashback and he remembers one of the last time that he saw this woman who had gone missing. And here it is. Our last day working together, Mara had been remote for most of her shift, maybe sick with some kind of premonition. Alone in the break room, when I tried asking her what was wrong, she shook her head. She hadn't been eating or sleeping well, couldn't keep her food down. She was so frightened her husband had figured it out. It's going to be okay, I tried reassuring her. No, she said, it won't. It won't ever again. Her eyes, so round and shining most days, looked pink and bloodshot under the fluorescent lights, the skin pouched and bruised beneath the sockets. She looked lost, her face ashen. Later that night, after closing the bank and locking the doors, she escorted herself to the bathroom, and when she came back out, she said, "You're going to have to drive me to the hospital, Lucien." Her breathing shivery as she described fainting in the bathroom after a dizzy spell and hitting her head on the sink. Had I been driving so fast because I was angry with her? Dangerous driving like that. Slow down, she said, but I acted as if I hadn't heard. If the car hydroplaned, if I had to brake suddenly, no way to know what might loom out of the storm ahead of us. But nothing happened on the way to the hospital. I got her there, safe and sound. I just didn't know I wouldn't ever see her again when I dropped her off at the emergency room entrance. I just didn't know that there was $5,000 missing from the bank, from the vault back at the bank. My adrenaline up, aching with feelings I couldn't yet name. I still had my foot pressed on the accelerator on the way home after dropping her off, and it ended up skidding right through a stop sign and into a speeding pickup that made mincemeat of my Civic. The guy in the pickup was hurtled through the windshield and across the road, his body blazing a 30-foot meteor-like channel through somebody's front lawn. This turned out to be a good thing because after smashing into my Civic, the fuel line in his pickup caught fire. I woke to heat, gasoline burning in my nostrils, the frantic squeal of metal on metal as paramedics tried to cut me from the pinned wreckage with the jaws of life before I passed out again. My own foretaste of hell. I know some of this because the pickup driver later came to visit me in the hospital, a lanky kid wearing a Twins baseball cap, his arm in a sling, since they'd had to replace lost skin there with skin from the back of his legs. He was otherwise miraculously unhurt. "You got a raw deal here, dude," he said. "This is why I don't wear a seatbelt." The cops searched my car for the money and didn't find it. Harry Larkin cleared me of suspicion, the burden falling on Mara, who disappeared that night. She never checked into the hospital where I would spend the next 10 days. The more I thought about it, the more I wondered, if Mara had stolen the money, she could have lied about other things. Where did you go, Mara, and why? Were you really pregnant and unsure about the father and what to do? Did you really miscarry? Did you even feel a shadow of what I felt for you? And so that's just a brief flashback where he remembers the last time that he saw her as he goes to this church. And I'm just going to read just one more brief passage here before we open it up to you guys and to the questions that you all might have too. And so in the second passage, he becomes the caretaker of this house out in the country. And he thinks he's going to be alone. He's imagining all the solitude. He's imagining he's a game designer, all the work that he's going to get done on this game that he's designing. And so he thinks he's going to have this lonely winter. But here's what happens. So one day he's watching a movie. I was just getting into The Exorcist when the doorbell rang. The sound jarred me from the dark dream of the movie. Who could possibly be here? This house was in the middle of nowhere. I paused the movie and climbed the spiral staircase. I opened the door to reveal a skinny girl who appeared to be about my age and dressed in a pea green army coat, a duffel bag slung over her shoulder. Her dark hair was chopped short, her features sharp and hawkish, her eyes brown and almond-shaped. Her coat appeared too thin for the weather, her face pale as the clouds dropping snow behind her. She tilted her head bird-like, as if I was the mystery here. Who are you? Me? Lucien. I'm looking after this place for the Crolls. Lucien. She frowned as if she disapproved of the name. The girl peered past me into the foyer, as if looking for someone. Where are my parents? Parents? Neither Kroll had mentioned any daughter. Rambling through the house, I'd seen no pictures of this girl, no toys or dolls or any sort of evidence that any child had ever lived here. The only framed photographs mostly featured Mr. Kroll in blazed orange or camo, posing with recently slain animals, elk or bear or some other luckless beast, blood freckling the leaves about him. She hugged herself with her arms and let out an exasperated sigh. Her lips had a bluish cast from the cold. Listen, I don't know who you are. Her tongue darted out to touch her lips, and her eyes locked on mine, as if she'd made some vital determination. Without another word, she pushed past me, tracking snow into the foyer. I snagged her by the elbow. Hey, I said, I didn't say you could come in. The girl looked thin and bony, but she shook out of my grip, dropped her duffel, and jabbed one finger right in the center of my chest. She smelled like she hadn't bathed in a month, a musky animal odor overwhelming in tight quarters. What have you done with my mom and dad? She asked, advancing on me until she had me backed against the wall. They're in Texas, I told her, still not sure what to believe. I squeezed past her to the open door, taking one fresh gulp of cold air before shutting it and turning it back to her. South Padre Island, at least until March or April. I'm caring for the house and dog while they're gone. Kaiser, she said, her nose twitching. And they're gone all winter? She made it sound like they'd never done it before, which had not been my impression. They couldn't wait to escape the cold. She quirked one thin eyebrow, as if she knew there was more to it than that. I hadn't mentioned any of the Y2K talk. I considered it vaguely reassuring that she knew the name of the dog. They'll be back when the snow melts, I continued. If the world doesn't end in December, I didn't add. And you're in contact with them? I massaged my sore hip, which ached from the cold the girl had brought into the room with her. I have their number in case something goes wrong, such as a stranger forcing her way into the house. Are you hurt? It's nothing. So, you're their daughter? You think they would have mentioned something like that? She spread out her hands, palms up. Why would they? We've been estranged. She lingered on that word, her small, sharp face tightening at some unpleasant memory. They wouldn't expect me to come here for the holidays. There aren't any pictures of you anywhere, I said. Not a single room had any girlish trace, like a stuffed bear or a pink quilt. But then again, she didn't seem like the girlish type. Thanksgiving was little more than a week away. How long was she planning to stay? I resented this intrusion on my peace. We aren't on speaking terms. My dad wiped his hands at me. She made a gesture, a flat slapping sound, as her palms came together. I could picture Mr. Kroll doing the same. I'll call them, I said. They'll want to know you're here. She shook her head, her brown eyes huge and pleading. Don't, she said. The pain in my hip jogged up into my skull and started to party there. Starbursts began to pop and flare at the corner of my vision. Not again. Not now. I didn't feel so hot. After the accident, migraines came on when I was stressed, thunderclouds boiling up inside my brain. I wasn't expecting a happy homecoming, she said. I just need a place to stay for a while. I took the bus from Bellingham, then walked the rest of the way. Bellingham? I pinched the skin between my eyes. That was halfway across the country. Hey, what's wrong with you? I just need to sit down a minute. And the girl led me into the kitchen by the elbow and sat beside me in the chairs. She banged around the cabinets before finding a glass she filled at the tap. Shaking, I accepted the glass and stood again and started walking away. My sumatriptan was on the nightstand in my bedroom, and I needed it now. The girl talked to me. I still didn't know her name, though I thought there was something off about her story. But I had a pressing physical concerns of my own, a monsoon drumming behind my temples. In the bedroom, pain walloped me. I nearly dropped the glass I was carrying. Felt like I had a whole fraternity inside my skull, all of them drunk and hurling bottles at the walls inside my head. I managed to set the glass down and reach for my medication, but I was shaking so badly by then I couldn't get it open. Here, the girl said. She took it from my hands, unscrewed the cap, and fished out a pill. Open up, she commanded, and I did, and she set the pill on my tongue gingerly, like she was doling out a communion wafer. I chased it with a gulp of water, but the migraine had me in such a fierce grip I couldn't even see straight. The girl guided me to the bed, pulled back the covers. I felt her take my shoes off. I no longer noticed the intensity of her odor. Her voice was soft as she laid a cool hand on my forehead, a winter priestess attending her parishioner. It's going to be okay, she said. I shut my eyes, unable to respond. Hadn't I promised Mara the same thing? She shut off the lights and left me in the dark, where the pill warred with a fraternity of pain and eventually won out. I was so tired. How long had it been since I'd had a full night's rest, undisturbed? The medicine made me woozy, so woozy that I shut my eyes to rest and soon slipped off into sleep. And so that's the one of the other central characters who Lucian encounters in the novel by the name of Arwen, and she also becomes a prominent figure in the novel. And if you haven't picked up yet from those two passages, Lucian is a little bit of an unreliable narrator. He has been through this really traumatic car accident. It's left him with these intense migraines. Sometimes he feels like he sees things that are not there. And so there's a sense, especially early on, that maybe you can't entirely rely on the things that he's telling you about in the story. So that's what it is. It's a story that's a mystery. It's a story about what happened to this young man over one winter when he becomes entangled with the people of this church. It's a story that in some ways reckons with racism, reckons with belief in end times, and those kinds of things that are distinctly, uniquely American. And it's coming out in October 2020. I'm excited about it. Also incredibly nervous. It is a nervous time because you never know how people are going to respond to the story and what's going to happen as well too. And so this is my very first time reading from it. So I do apologize if I stumbled over some of the passages. So I'm new to this as well. But I thought I'd turn it over to you, to all of you, to see what questions that maybe you have about writing or about this novel or about any of my other novels. I'd be happy to answer those questions.
Well, I'll get things started here, Tom. You mentioned that he's an unreliable narrator, and I'm assuming that that was by choice. And I'm wondering if you utilize that unreliability at all when you're setting out the story or the actions that take place within the story.
Yeah, I don't know if you necessarily go in with a definite plan that I'm going to make this narrator unreliable, but I definitely, as I got into the story and into this young man's life and into his mind, I got the sense, that he lives this very dreamlike existence out in this country, and that he has trouble sorting sometimes his dreams from the reality that he's facing in the world around him. So it wasn't a plan, but it's something that I gradually came to know as I was writing it and setting the story down. But yeah, thank you. That's a great question, though.
Tom, how much of the story like came to you and how much came to you as you were writing? Just listening to you talk, I was wondering.
That's a great question. And so I love that quote from E.L. Doctorow. He says that writing a novel is a little bit like driving a car home with one headlight. You can't see very far, but you can make it home the whole way. And so that's often me. I feel like when I'm driving, or when I'm writing, I'm the guy out there driving with one headlight, and I don't always know what's going to happen. As I mentioned, I just knew I had this young man who was the caretaker of this house, and that he was searching for this lost woman, and I didn't know what had happened to her or who the people at this church were. These are things that I discovered as I wrote. And that's, for me, I prefer to write this way without having a firm or definite plan, because then you discover things along the way. And that, to me, is the greatest pleasure that you get in writing, is when you are surprised by what you write, when you discover things as you go. And so I guess they say that writers come in two different, there's the plotters and there's the pantsers. The plotters plot things out beforehand, and then there's the people who write by the seat of their pants. And I guess I fall into that pantsers segment there. So great question, though.
I have a question.
Sure.
Do you work at a word process? Do you key it out or write it out or cut and paste? What's your process that way?
So I definitely start writing out in a journal. And in fact, this is the journal that I use to sketch out some of the early chapters. And I start there, but then I go pretty rapidly to a word processor soon in the process. And I like to write on my MacBook. I use Pages in the early parts. And what I tend to do is I really feel like a novel, for me, grows layers over time. And so what I'll do is I'll write a chapter out from start to finish. And then I print that chapter out and I mark that chapter up. And then I'll delete the chapter on the screen. And then I have one of these page up things right here. I'll often put the pages that I'm working on right there. And then I write from that blank screen. And I feel like then when I'm writing from a blank screen, if I need to make any changes, I can make those changes. I'm more free to make the changes. If I'm looking at those words that are on the screen, they're already locked in, it's much more difficult for me to make the changes. And so I like that idea. When we talk about revision, we tend to emphasize that part of it. Revision, it sounds unpleasant. We associate it with words like regurgitate, repeat. These are not things that we look forward to doing, but I think that we really need to focus more on that vision part of the process, that it's a vision that you're looking for. You're searching for something new, hoping to discover something as you go through the process. So that's partly how I write is I definitely write and print things out, and then I'm a relentless reviser for sure.
Hey, Tom.
Yeah.
I suppose just kind of piggybacking off of that revision comment there, I've done a fair amount of walking myself into corners with writing, and then sort of abandoning the project because I sort of revisioned it so many times and kind of lost the plot, I guess.
Right.
How do you, when you catch fire on a story and you're writing and you're like, this is the one, how do you like rein in other potential ideas and just sort of like, give yourself walls, I guess, for the story to be in? Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I really think that a big part of it is immersion. You need to be immersed in the world that you're writing, in the story that you're writing. And so I have a couple of projects that I work on during a year. And I really do think that, I dedicate myself, I'm going to work on this for the next few months. And I say, for the next few months, this is the only thing that I'm going to write. And if those other ideas are kind of crowding back behind, maybe, setting it aside and journaling for just a little bit about those other ideas so you can get the thoughts or ideas down on the page, but then sticking with that one thing. I think sticking with that one thing until you've got it finished, until you take it to the end. To me, that's the only way that I can get things done, because I feel like if I stop too soon in the process, that maybe I won't come back to it. And so I often feel like if I can get something done and it's imperfect, and then set it aside for a few months and let it rest, let it cool. And so I'll come back and look at it then with fresh eyes. But that imperfection will be nagging at me. It'll be kind of driving me or urging me to get back to it. Like, oh, I didn't quite get that story right. So I want to come back to it. I want to redo it then. And so that's why I feel like it's important to get it down and print it out, and then put it away as much as you can, in a drawer, so that you can work on something else. But yeah, it's not an easy process. I've got, right now I'm working on a novel called Ashes to Ashes, and it's set in a small town. It's a much more contemporary novel. It's set in 2020. I started writing it during the pandemic, and that was the best time of day, was working on this project before I read the news or anything like that, just being in the world of these characters. But I set that aside during summer because I'm teaching 2 summer classes, and pulled back up. I have a novel of the French Revolution that has not been able to find a publisher. And so I'm back to revising it again. This is like the 5th or 6th time I revised this novel. And, I feel like the story eventually is going to find a home, and it's frustrating and it's easy to lose hope. But I won't let it go. I refuse to let the story go. I come back to it. I'm going to get it right. I'm going to get it right this time. And so I'm going to work on that until August, and then I'll pick back up that other novel, Ashes to Ashes. And I do think it's good, like you mentioned, having more than one thing to work on, because then you have that ability to set it aside and come back to it with those fresh eyes. Yeah. Does that answer your question, or?
Yeah, and I suppose to like get a little more specific about a single project, like oftentimes I find myself like, oh, what if they did this, or what if instead of this we did this instead, right? And so like plot lines, the plot is going this way, and then suddenly you have new ideas, and you're like do you allow yourself to kind of explore those like potential branches in the plot, or do you? I mean, I guess you describe yourself as as a pantser, right? So. Maybe you do follow those plots when they kind of branch off, but I guess just like knowing when to like stick to the plot, I guess is my question.
Yeah, and I think that's a great question. I really feel like the only way to do it is to write it out and see if it works. So I mean, like right now when I'm writing this novel set during the French Revolution. Part of what got me started on the project is the first time I visited Paris, it was raining, and we went to Notre Dame, and just standing underneath the gargoyles of Notre Dame, they're designed to funnel rain away from the church, the cathedral, and it looked like these creatures were alive, looked like they were alive during in the rain there. And so I just had this idea, like, what about a French Revolution novel, but the gargoyles of Notre Dame are living creatures. And so in the draft I'm writing right now, and you can see why it hasn't found a publisher. It's a strange, bizarre idea. As if the French Revolution wasn't messy enough, let's throw some gargoyles in there too. But I've had fun writing it in this current draft I'm writing. What makes it a little bit different is I'm exploring the idea of what if one of the gargoyles is one of the narrators. So the gargoyle is actually narrating parts of the story, and I'm having fun writing. Will I stick with that? Will it still be in it if it becomes a book? I don't know, but right now I'm just enjoying it and seeing where that idea takes me. And like in this novel that I read from here, I didn't know what had happened to the woman, and I wrote several different endings until I got to the ending where I knew, okay, this is it. This is really what happened. But I only knew that by writing it out first. It's a very messy, time-consuming process. I wish that there was a way to figure out that you could look at these different plot strands and understand, like, yep, this is the one that I definitely need to write, not that one. But I feel like I can only find that out by writing it. So, great question. How are you guys doing with your music, with things being shut down and things like that? How have you guys been adjusting?
Yeah, thanks for asking. I was just doing some mixing earlier before we hopped on here. So it's been pretty, I mean, I'm sure you've been, if we're all kind of creative in some way, I'm sure, if we're hanging out here. And this has been kind of awful in a lot of ways, but it's been great for creative time. So she and I have been writing a lot writing a lot of new music and stories and poems and stuff. It's been really cool.
Yeah, and really kind of like you're saying, creating that time, really being thoughtful about doing creative work at a specific time, scheduling it out
Yeah.
so that we're not waiting for inspiration to come, because especially when we're stressed out, we're anxious, we're sad, things are happening all the time that are terrible, and that can be a heavy weight that creativity can't come up through, in my experience, for me. So if I purposefully set aside time where creative work is going to happen, then I
it's-
allow that. Yeah.
It's like
little bit of
clocking
light
in,
to
yeah.
come through. Yeah.
That is so beautifully stated, and I really think that's so vital. You know, it sounds counterintuitive. I mean, scheduled creativity, doesn't that sound like it takes the fun out of it? You know, let's have some spontaneous. No, but you have to schedule. You have to block that time out, and then if you do, I feel like the muses then will reward you. And psychologists, I guess they do when they do studies. If you condition yourself to that habit, then your brain actually kind of wakes up and you become more productive during that time period that you've blocked out. So I think that it's not only a great idea, research does support it too, that's the way to get things done too. So, yeah.
And I want to take this moment for folks who are on this call who may not know Colin and Laura, but they are Goodnight Stardust, amongst many other things. If you've read some of the Free Press seasonal articles, Colin has written a couple of those for the Free Press. So they are probably the epitome of the creative couple in that, as far as I'm concerned, because I have a hard time, you know, I get inspired in one area, but I only have that one area. And I don't have that opportunity sometimes if I have a roadblock to maybe pick up a guitar instead and see where that leads me. So in many ways, I envy them for that. But I just pick up a camera. Sometimes that does it too.
Beautiful work.
Thank you. You're too.
Does anybody else have any questions? If not, you're going to force me to ask some more.
I'll do one. I have one.
Okay, Deb.
People say that if you wake up in the night and you have an idea, it's good to write it down so you can go back to sleep. Do you do that? Do you get ideas when you aren't working or scheduling your time?
Yeah, definitely. And I don't know if anyone else has had this experience, but my dreams have been especially vivid during the pandemic right now. And so I will definitely, if there's an idea or a sentence that I have, I sometimes I have to get up and write it down. You know, so otherwise I feel like, because sometimes I've thought, well, I'll remember it in the morning or it'll come back to me. I don't have to do it. But then in the morning, whatever the great idea it was, it's gone. It's no longer there. And so I do really think that it's a good idea to get up and write things down. If you're feeling particularly inspired or have a great dream image, just getting up and jotting a few things down, I think is fantastic. One of my favorite books on writing is called On Writing by Stephen King. And he's got this great passage in there where he talks about misery, which I think is one of his best novels. And it came to him on the novel Misery in a dream. He was on board at this airplane and he had this dream of this writer who was kidnapped by one of his fans. And he even had like a line of dialogue. And so he describes, you know, jotting it down on a napkin, you know, what later became, you know, one of his best novels. And it came to him in a dream. And so I do think that you are attuned to that as writers, as artists, that we do need to be especially attuned to that. You know, that dream language can sometimes give us some really great inspiration. And Mike had mentioned, you know, as far as feeding your creativity, you know, not being able to do different things, but I think walking, you know, all the walking that Mike does, for instance, you know, walking is a great place to go for ideas as well too. And that if you talk things out as you're walking, you also get better ideas. I'm definitely a big believer in that. And I also think that research also supports that too. Any other questions out there too?
Well, one thing I've been curious about, because I've been trying to work through it a little bit too, is, you know, I came through a newspaper background. So I'm used to sitting down and taking one subject, 15 to 20 column inches, and then moving on. When I was in the creative writing program and elsewhere, my problem comes with taking that short form and expanding it into novel length. And I'm wondering if you've got any suggestions on how to help bridge that mental obstacle.
Yeah, it's hard. I don't know, you know, in terms of writing longer, you mean longer pieces that still span out. I think that there are different techniques. Hemingway, what he would do is he would always stop his work at the end of the day in the middle of a sentence and not finish the sentence, so that when he came back the next day, he could start that, you know, be caught back up in the world of the story again. And so I think that one of the big things that might help you get past, you know, those page limitations is having a driving question that you were hoping to answer through your next day's writing. Who is this girl who shows up at the house? Is she really the daughter of the owners? What really happened to Mara? What are these people at the church that he's visiting? Are they insane? Are they dangerous? You know, so you have this question that is driving you to keep writing that next passage. So there's no stopping point. You know, you might reach the end of a chapter, but you know that in the next, you have to write that next scene because there's still that question out there that you haven't yet answered. And so we talk about withholding, that's an important part of writing, is that you don't reveal everything right away. And gradually the reader, you know, discovers things. But as writers too, I think sometimes we also have to practice that, you know, that you don't know exactly, but you're writing toward that and hoping to discover it. And I think maybe if you have those kinds of driving questions, Mike, that it might push you to write longer and, you know, get deeper into a piece.
All right, thank you.
Ben.
I have a question.
Sure.
Could you tell us a little bit about one of your other books, like The Night Birds?
Sure.
Was that the one about the Dakota conflict, or was that another one?
Yeah, so the Nightbirds is about the Dakota conflict. It's my very first novel, and actually I wrote it as part of the MSU Mankato's the MFA program. So when I was there from 2002 to 2005 for my Master of Fine Arts, I was working on the novel. It was my graduate thesis, and you know, so that novel, it's set during two distinctive time periods, in 1876 and in 1862. And again, here you have a young man. He's grown up. He has this sense that his parents played some role in the Dakota conflict, but they refused to speak about it. And it's what happens in one summer in 1876 when his aunt is released from the insane asylum at St. Peter. And she comes back home and she's carrying the stories of all these stories that he's longed to hear about what happened to his family during the Dakota conflict. And so it's his gradual discovery of these family secrets and the story of the families that he's hoped to hear all along. And so as she appears in the story, her name is Hazel, you're kind of cast back into the past, into 1862, during that time period, and you're living on the prairie with this family, right during the summer where everything happened. And so it goes back and forth between those two time periods. 1876 is also a really troubled time period in Minnesota history, because that's when you had the locust plagues, you had the James Dalton Younger gang riding rampant through up from Missouri, robbing banks and stuff like that too. And so it goes back and forth between those two time periods. You know, since we've been talking a little bit about memory and present day, I do feel like even though that's a deeply historical novel, even when you're writing a historical novel, if things are happening in the present day, it's going to impact that historical novel you're writing. So one of the things, for instance, that happened in The Nightbirds is while I was writing it, my wife had a grand mal seizure, and she had no prior history of epilepsy. And she stopped breathing for like 5 minutes. And it was probably the 5 most terrifying minutes of my life, you know, as I was calling, you know, frantically calling the paramedics and everything like that too. And, you know, eventually she was fine and she got better and we got medicine for her. But going through that, it was relatively traumatic. You know, for months afterwards, I would lay awake listening to the simple miracle of her breathing in the dark.
We lost the sound.
I knew that I was going to have to, can you still hear me now?
Yeah, no, that's good.
Okay. So I knew that I was going to have to work that out through the novel. And so through the novel, Hazel, that character who comes from the insane asylum, she was there and partly because of her epilepsy. They didn't know how to treat it back then, and sometimes you would end up in an asylum. And so it's a deeply historical work about a very controversial, troubled history here in Minnesota. But again, your personal life also gets tangled up in the story that you're writing. I loved doing the research for that novel. And in fact, if I could just mention briefly, talking a little bit about researching a novel, one of the things that I did to research it was I actually went to the St. Peter Asylum, and they have a museum there that you can go and tour. I don't think it's open right now because of COVID restrictions, but they would actually give you a key and send you up into that museum to tour it on your own. And all the rooms are dark. And so as you're going through this old asylum in these darkened rooms, what you'll find happen is that you'll come around a corner and turn on a light, and all of a sudden there'll be like a nurse there, or this mannequin dressed in a nurse's outfit. And so it's a spooky place to go and visit and do research. But one of the things that I discovered is that patients who were on good behavior, patients who were not disturbed, could have a cabin outside behind the asylum, a place of their own where they could tend a garden and be by themselves. And so here I was picturing that an asylum in the 19th century would be hell on earth. And what I in fact found out is that in some cases, women whose lives were so hard in the 19th century on the prairies, their lives were so hard it broke them. And they went to this asylum as a place of refuge. And so that kind of surprised me. It turned on its heels this idea that I had of what it would be like to be in the asylum at the time, and it transformed the world of the story. And so The Nightbirds is historical fiction. It's my first book. It's been out for about 10 years. It's kind of your first book. I still get letters from readers about it. And so I'd be happy to answer like any other questions that anybody has about it too.
Thanks.
Any other questions that anyone else has too? Yeah, Mira.
I'm curious. I write creative nonfiction.
Yeah.
And I find myself, trying to approach history, but through, some of the details that I might know about, so it's a switch on that. I wonder if you have any suggestions about, for writing creative nonfiction as opposed to, when you can just go ahead and make it up.
Yeah, that's hard. I feel like when it comes to researching whether you're talking creative nonfiction or whether you're talking fiction, one of the things that I heard another writer talk about is that what you were searching for is what they call the uninventable detail. And the uninventable detail is a detail so beautiful, so interesting that it couldn't possibly be made up. And so I think if you've got that uninventable detail, that oftentimes nonfiction is the best place to put it. But I will say that, for the Nightbirds, some of these quote unquote uninventable details, when I came across them, I knew I had to put them in the story. So an example for me would be, I found this story in the archives of New Ulm, and it was a story about a man. He's wandering his grove 50 years after the Dakota conflict. He looks down inside a hollow tree and he sees a skeleton inside of this hollow tree. And so they haul out the skeleton, and they find out based on the paperwork on the skeleton that it was a person that was in the Dakota conflict. And they realized that what happened is this person probably crawled down inside of this hollow tree to escape the massacre and got stuck there and literally starved to death. And so when you come across an image like that as a writer, I feel like you have to work with it. There's so many different, metaphoric echoes that go with that as well too. And so that became a part of the novel or a part of the story. Now, when it comes to whether or not something is an essay or a novel chapter, I feel like you have a lot more freedom with fiction. With an essay, you are bound by the literal truth. You have to tell the absolute truth. Whereas with fiction, I feel like what you're exploring more is an emotional truth. You're trying to get at an emotional truth behind it. And so it might not be literally what happened, but you're exploring a much more emotional truth. And that's part of the process. Am I answering your question, Mira, or is that?
Well, I'm just like playing with all this, and I heard about, like sometimes I'll try to write some poetry and then but in that same style. The thing that really stood out to me is when you talked about having a driving question. And I think that that's often where I get stuck, because it's like I have a story to tell, and I think it'd be a lot more interesting with a driving question. And so, part of it is just to try to understand myself how to play and keep moving. Yeah.
Right. And I feel like sometimes that telling a story is a little bit like you take two stones and you bring them together, and those two stones make sparks. So for instance, this novel that I read to you a little bit about the land, when I first started writing it, it was set back in the 19th century. And it was this family living out there on the land, kind of like my family, afraid of end times. And the story really didn't go anywhere. It didn't go anywhere at all. But then when I combined that story with the story of a young man who's investigating or searching after this woman he's been involved with, and she's lost now. Now suddenly, instead of having these two stones that are apart, I bring those rocks together and they start making sparks. And now suddenly the story has momentum, it has fire. And it was the same thing to me with my second novel, Little Wolves, which features an act of violence that happens in this small town. I had originally started writing about this pastor and this young teacher who moved to a small town. They're strangers there, and they're strangers to each other. And it was kind of what happened to them in the small town. But as I was writing that, I remembered this true small town murder story that another teacher had told me. And so suddenly, again here, I have this sparks. I have this young couple out here on the prairie who are strangers. And I've got this murder story, this really true murder story that was kind of that haunted me for years afterwards. And again here, my two rocks come together and start to make sparks. And so it might be that if you are stuck on a particular work, that you're looking for that other stone out there that you can get in there and make some sparks or make some good friction to get that story going. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I love what you said about emotion.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's like how to bring that in. Yeah.
It's definitely an important part of the process for me. I know that if I'm writing towards some ultimate emotional truth, that I'm in a good territory, that this is, if it's emotionally flat territory, and then I feel like the story doesn't have life yet.
Could you say a little more, like give an example, what you mean about, emotional truth?
So what I would say is, like, in my first novel, The Nightbirds, in the very first chapter, the families, they've been devastated by these locust plagues, and the young man has just done something terrible. He's let out this Indian that his father captured, and he's really scared about what's going to happen when his dad gets home. And so, I have no idea what it feels like to walk across a field of moving locusts. I've never done that. But I have been that boy who is afraid about what's going to happen when dad gets home. And so that real emotion, that fear, that memory, to me, is a place that allowed me to make that chapter come alive, because that's the emotion that's driving the story as well there. Anybody else have other questions too, or?
Well, I don't know, do we want, are you folks interested in doing a writing exercise with Tom?
Great.
Four thumbs up over here.
Excellent. Excellent. All right. So I'm going to do one writing activity, and I'm just going to tear out a page here, and I'll do it as well too. So if you've got a pen and a piece of paper around you, we can go ahead and do the writing activity. It's one that what I feel like, again, and it looks like we have a couple of people just getting up to get some paper and stuff like that. So I'll wait just a minute here while people get those papers out.
Is your class still going on? Are you near the end of the quarter?
We end on July the 31st. So we've got
Okay.
11 days left in the semester. The students are frantically working on their research papers. So it's kind of a tough time of this semester. Summer classes are always difficult, you know, because you take a whole 17-week semester, you cram it into 7 weeks, and it makes for a much more intense experience for the
Yeah.
students. All right, so we'll wait just a moment here. It looks like most people are getting back out. I think we're still waiting. It looks like Laura and Colin are.
Where are you teaching?
I teach at Normandale Community College, and I've been there since 2009, just about. I taught at a private Catholic college called Silver Lake College. Sadly, they closed down during the pandemic, so they no longer exist. But that was my first teaching job out of Mankato. And I taught there for 3 years over in Manitowoc, Wisconsin, but I've been at Normandale ever since. And it's a good place to be. I like it there. And so I teach as part of the creative writing program, but composition courses are bread and butter, of course. So that's the majority of what I teach. All right. Looks like we have most people back. So I'll go ahead and start us in this activity here, and then I'll leave you with one final activity to think about. So if you're still looking for like, okay, where are some more places where I can go to get ideas? I'm going to give you an activity that another writer gave to me that actually really helped inspire me and help me understand a story that I was struggling with at the time. So we'll do this activity here in the very beginning, and then we'll see where that takes us. And so I often feel like one of the good things that you can do is that when you're first starting is to sketch things out. And so we'll start by doing just a little bit of drawing. And what I want to challenge you to do right here, and your artistic skills do not matter, but what I want to challenge you to do is to sketch out the blueprints of the first home where you remember living. So sketch out a blueprint of the first house where you remember living. And just kind of draw out or diagram the house, the layout of the house. If you want to, you can include the yard. I often find it's useful to me to include the yard as part of the drawings too, just to give you some ideas. So I'm going to be doing it alongside you guys as you guys do it as well. Just a couple more minutes. just about another minute here. All right. So you might not be fully finished here, but you should have kind of a rough sketch now of the blueprint of your first house, maybe included the yard as well too. Excellent, excellent. And so your next job is this. Our next idea is I want you to go through, and on that blueprint, I want you to make marks anytime as you let your pen kind of hover over the blueprint, and any place on that blueprint that sparks a memory, put a mark on it. So for instance, if I'm hovering over the bathroom mirror, I might remember the time I tried to summon Bloody Mary in the bathroom. It doesn't have to be a deep or profound memory or anything like that. Maybe I'm hovering over the front yard here and I'm remembering the Springer Spaniel that emerged out of this winter storm that came out of nowhere, this lost dog that suddenly appeared in our yard. Maybe I'm hovering over the bedroom and I'm remembering the bunk beds with my brothers and how I would wait until they fell asleep at night before I could also fall asleep. And so whatever it is, just kind of let your pen hover and make a mark, and then just jot down just a brief initial. Wherever it is, there's a memory that has some emotion to it. So we talked earlier about trying to find emotion. If there's some emotional resonance to the memory, make a mark there on that blueprint and just jot an initial down next to it so you can go back and potentially maybe write about those memories. So you're looking for memories anywhere on the map. This is a map into your memory, into your past. So hopefully you have a list maybe about 7 or 8 things that you wrote about, or that you could recognize a memory that maybe had some kind of emotional resonance. Maybe it happened a long time ago and you haven't thought about it in all these years, but now you remembered it now by making that blueprint and that map. And so let's just do one more brief part of this here too, because I'm very curious what it might inspire for you as well. And so I want you to choose just one of those memories from anywhere on your blueprint. And I want you to write about that memory and write about it as if it's happening to you right now. So we'll write for just about 7 minutes here, and we'll do a free write. And with the free writes, you try and write as quickly as you can. If you get stuck, you go back and repeat the previous sentence, and that way you keep going, and you don't allow yourself to stop or to get stuck. And so choose just one of those memories, a memory that has an emotional resonance to it, and really try and use all of your sensory details: sight, taste, touch, hearing, smell. Bring all of your senses into telling that story or that memory. So let's write now for any one of those memories, just one of them from off of your blueprint, and write for just about 7 minutes now. Or if you want to leave that sentence unfinished like Hemingway, because want to come back to it, I think that's okay too. Anyone want to share what they wrote, what came up, or what they discovered? If it was something that you hadn't thought about in many years, or something that you weren't expecting to write about, if you feel comfortable sharing it, I think we have time for at least one person to share, or one or two people.
I'm ready.
All right, great. Margaret, let's hear what you've got.
Okay, I wanted to show you my blueprint because it kind of was bad, but that's my house that I grew up in. And then as I was writing, I remembered something. So the spot that I'm remembering, it's kind of a dark spot there. That's where the phone was in our house.
Oh, wow.
And it was a ringer type phone, so it's pretty old fashioned. My sister told me I had another call from the mysterious stranger who wouldn't give his name or number. I racked my brain trying to figure out who he was. The only likely possibility was my high school classmate's apparently shy brother. I really wasn't interested in encouraging a relationship with him, so I never asked her if he might have been the mystery caller.
Wow.
That's it.
I love the idea of the mystery caller. Did you ever find out who it was, or?
Oh, I could still ask her if she's still alive. He's not alive anymore.
Wow.
But I was pretty suspicious that it was her brother.
And that's a great title for a piece too, the mystery caller. I love it. Thank you for sharing, Margaret.
Thank you.
Anyone else out there want to share a piece that they wrote? Looks like Deb will share.
Yep. Here's my pre-write. Here's my, I don't know if you can see it. I have a little drawing of my house.
Oh, that's great.
The place that I identified for this memory is the couch in the living room. I'm a kid with the flu, home from school. Mom is ironing in the kitchen with the radio on. I should be asleep. I want to believe if I just lay still and nobody says my name, the nausea will pass away. I am glad for the coolness my hand feels as I tuck it between the couch back and the cushion, that space. The upholstery isn't noteworthy, but there are 4 Currier and Ives prints hanging on the wall behind the couch, one for each season. I imagine myself in the winter landscape, the cool, snowy scene, sitting up on the buggy seat beside my dad and feeling just fine.
That is great. I love the sensory details. I could picture that scene as well. So great writing, Deb. Thank you.
It was fun to share.
Any last ones out there? Anyone else want to share? All right. And so the goal, I think, is hopefully surprise or discovery. And so if I want to just leave you with one potential activity to think about, if you want to do a little bit more writing, is just this idea of write about these 3 things: a memory, a wish, and an image of home. A memory, a wish, and an image of home. Now, I was given that assignment by another writing teacher, and I was at the time working on my second novel, Little Wolves, and I really resented the assignment. I got to be honest with you, because I'm a fiction writer, and so I didn't like being tasked with writing nonfiction. I make things up, was my idea. And but But I started writing and I got into this memory, and the memory was of my uncle holding this picture. And it was a picture of a woman he'd been involved with, not my aunt, but another woman. And this moment where he told the story from his past, a story that I'd never heard from. And so I started writing about my uncle, and I realized that one of my main characters, the main character in the novel, who I didn't really understand or get, that I was going to give some of the same qualities of my uncle to this character. My uncle was a big man, bear-like, very protective of people around him. And so suddenly writing about this memory allowed me to understand a character in the novel that I was also writing at the same time. And so what I would encourage you to think about is this idea of where memory mingles with the imagination, looking for those memories that have an emotional resonance. And if you can find those things, then your writing, I feel like, may also come to life. And so I thank you all for your time. It's a lovely afternoon out there. And I hope you get a chance to get out there and enjoy it. It was a pleasure to meet with you all and talk with you all. So thank you very much to Mike and to the people of Vine for this invitation.
Well, thank you, Tom. I think we all greatly appreciate it. I'll admit I was exchanging some messages with Laura as this went on, and we were talking about how much we were enjoying just the easy way. It's obvious you're a teacher because you were doing that very easily with us as you were answering our questions. So I appreciate you sharing that knowledge and that wisdom that you've gained through 3 novels, 4 novels, 5 novels as you proceed. So thank you very much. I appreciate it. And if anybody, Tom, would it be all right if anybody has any questions that I share your email address with them if they inquire?
Please do. Yep. tmaltman@gmail.com. And
okay.
So I appreciate that. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody. Have a great afternoon. Tom, thank you very much for spending this hour and a half with us.
Thank you, Mike. Have a
you.
great
Thank you, everybody. Look for us next
Yep.
month. Alan
Bye.
Eskins. I think
Alan
it's the,
Eskins is great. I love his first novel, The Life We Bury, is a fantastic read. So,
and he's very good in a small group like this as well. So it'll be a lot of fun. We invite you to join us, Tom.
I just may.
All right.
Thanks.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Looking forward to reading your book, Tom.
Thank you. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Appreciate that. Bye.
Thank
everybody.
you.
Bye.